Chapter 2. The Circling Hand. During my holidays from school, I was allowed to stay in bed until long after my father had gone to work. He left our house every weekday at the stroke of 7 by the Anglican church bell. I would lie in bed awake, and I could hear all the sounds my parents made as they prepared for the day ahead. As my mother made my father his breakfast, my father would shave using his shaving brush that had an ivory handle and razor that matched. Then he would step outside to the little shed he had built for us as a bathroom to quickly bathe in water that he had instructed my mother to leave outside overnight in the dew. That way the water would be very cold, and he believed that cold water strengthened his back. If I had been a boy, I would have gotten the same treatment. But since I was a girl, and on top of that went to school only with other girls, my mother would always add some hot water to my bath water to take off the chill. On Sunday afternoons, while I was in Sunday school, my father took a hot bath. The tub was half filled with plain water, and then my mother would add a large cauldron full of water in which she had just boiled some bark and leaves from a bay leaf tree. The bark and leaves were there for no reason other than he liked the smell. He would then spend hours lying in this bath, studying his pool coupons or drawing examples of pieces of furniture he planned to make. When I came home from Sunday school, we would sit down to our Sunday dinner. My mother and I often took a bath together. Sometimes it was just a plain bath, which didn't take very long. Other times it was a special bath in which the barks and flowers of many different trees, together with all sorts of oils, were boiled in the same large cauldron. We would then sit in this tub in a darkened room with a strange-smelling candle burning away. As we sat in this bath, my mother would bathe different body parts. Then she would do the same to herself. We took these baths after my mother had consulted with her Obeah woman and with her mother and a trusted friend, and all three of them had confirmed that from the look of things around our house, the way a small scratch on my instep had turned into a small sore, then a large sore, and how long it had taken to heal, the way a dog she knew, and a friendly dog at that, suddenly turned and bit her, how a porcelain bowl she had carried from one eternity and hoped to carry into the next suddenly slipped out of her capable hands and broke into the pieces the size of grains of sand, how words she spoke in jest to a friend had been completely misunderstood. One of the many women my father had loved, had never married, but with whom he had children, was trying to harm my mother and me by setting bad spirits on us. When I got up, I placed my bedclothes and my nightie in the sun to air out, brushed my teeth and washed and dressed myself. My mother would then give me my breakfast, but since during my holidays I was not going to school, I wasn't forced to eat an enormous breakfast of porridge, eggs, an orange, or half a grapefruit, bread and butter and cheese. I could get away with just some bread and butter, and cheese and porridge and cocoa. I spent the day following my mother around and observing the way she did everything. When we went to the grocer's, she would point out to me the reason she bought each thing. I was shown a loaf of bread or a pound of butter from at least 10 different angles. When we went to market, if that day she wanted to buy some crabs, she would inquire from the person selling them if they came from near Parham. And if the person said yes, my mother did not buy the crabs. In Parham was the leper colony, and my mother was convinced that the crabs ate nothing but the food from the lepers' own plates. If we were then to eat the crabs, it wouldn't be long before we were lepers ourselves and living unhappily in the leper colony. How important I felt to be with my mother. For many people, their wares and provisions laid out in front of them would brighten up when they saw her coming and would try hard to get her attention. They would dive underneath their stalls and bring out goods even better than what they had on display. They were disappointed when she held something up in the air, looked at it, turning it this way and that, and then screwing up her face said, "I don't think so," and turned and walked away, off to another stall to see if someone who only last week had sold her some delicious Christophine had something that was just as good. They would call out after her turned back that next week they expected to have Edo's or Dashin or whatever, and my mother would say, "We'll see," in a very disbelieving tone of voice. If then we went to Mr. Kenneth, It would be only a few minutes, for he knew exactly what my mother wanted and always had it ready for her. Mr. Kenneth had known me since I was a small child, and he was always remind me of little things I had done. Then as he fed me a piece of raw liver he had set aside for me. It was one of the few things I liked to eat, and to boot it pleased my mother to see me eat something that was so good for me. And she would tell me in great detail the effect of raw liver would have on my red blood corpuscles. We walked home in the hot mid-morning sun, mostly without event. When I was much smaller, quite a few times, while I was walking with my mother, she would suddenly grab me and wrap me up in her skirt and drag me along with her as if in a great hurry. I would hear an angry voice saying angry things, and then, after we had passed the angry voice, my mother would release me. Neither my mother nor my father ever came straight out and told me anything, but I had put two and two together, and I knew that it was one of the women that my father had loved, and with whom he had had a child or children, and who never forgave him for marrying my mother and having me. It was one of those women who were always trying to harm my mother and me, and they must have loved my father very much, for not once did any of them ever try to hurt him, and whenever he passed them on the street, it was as if these women had never met him. When we got home, my mother started to prepare our lunch: pumpkin soup with droppers, banana fritters with saltfish stewed in antrova and tomatoes, fungi with saltfish stewed in antrova and tomatoes, or pepper pot, all depending on what my mother had found at the market that day. As my mother went about from pot to pot, stirring one, adding something to the other, I was ever in her wake. As she dipped into a pot of boiling something or other to taste for correct seasoning, she would give me a taste of it also, asking me what I thought. Not that she really wanted to know what I thought, for she had told me many times that my taste buds were not quite developed yet, but it was just to include me in everything. While she made our lunch, she would also keep an eye on her washing. If it was a Tuesday and the colored clothes had been starched, as she placed them on the line, I would follow, carrying a basket of clothespins for her. While she starched colored clothes were being dried on the line, the white clothes were being whitened on the stone heap. It was a beautiful stone heap that my father had made for her, an enormous circle of stones about 6 inches high in the middle of our yard. On it the soapy white clothes were spread out as the sun dried them, bleaching out all stains. They had to be made wet again by dousing them with buckets of water. On my holidays, I did this for my mother. As I watered the clothes, she would come up behind me, instructing me to get the clothes thoroughly wet, showing me a shirt that I should turn over so that the sleeves were exposed. Over our lunch, my mother and father talked to each other about the houses my father had to build, how disgusted he had become with one of his apprentices, or with Mr. Oti, what they thought of my schooling so far, what they thought of the noises Mr. Jarvis and his friends made for so many days when they locked themselves up inside Mr. Jarvis's house and drank rum and ate fish they had caught themselves and danced to the music of an accordion that they took turns playing. On and on they talked. As they talked, my head would move from side to side looking at them. When my eyes rested on my father, I didn't think very much of the way he looked, but when my eyes rested on my mother, I found her beautiful. Her head looked as if it should be on a sixpence. What a beautiful long neck and long plaited hair, which she pinned up around the crown of her head, because when her hair hung down it made her too hot. Her nose was the shape of a flower on the brink of opening. Her mouth, moving up and down as she ate and talked at the same time, was such a beautiful mouth. I could have looked at it forever, if I had to, and not mind. Her lips were wide and almost thin, and when she said certain words I could see small parts of big white teeth, so big and pearly, like some nice buttons on one of my dresses. I didn't care much about what she said when she was in the mood with my father. She made him laugh so she could hardly say a word before he would burst out laughing. We ate our food. I cleared the table. We said goodbye to my father as he went back to work. I helped my mother with the dishes, and then we settled into the afternoon. When my mother at 16, after quarreling with her father, left his house on Dominica and came to Antigua, she packed all her things in an enormous wooden trunk that she bought in Rousseau for almost 6 shillings. She painted the trunk yellow and green outside, and she lined the inside with wallpaper that had a cream-colored background with pink roses printed all over it. 2 days after she left her father's house, she boarded a boat and sailed for Antigua. It was a small boat, and the trip would have taken a day and a half ordinarily, but A hurricane blew up, and the boat was lost at sea for almost 5 days. By the time it got to Antigua, the boat was practically in splinters, and though 2 or 3 of the passengers were lost overboard, along with some of the cargo, my mother and her trunk were safe. Now, 24 years later, this trunk was kept under my bed, and in it were things that had belonged to me starting from just before I was born. There was the chemise made of white cotton with scallop edging around the sleeves, neck, and hem, and white flowers embroidered on the front, the first garment I wore after being born. My mother had made that herself, and once, when we were passing by, I was even shown the tree under which she sat as she made this garment. There were some of my diapers, with their handkerchief hemstitch that she had also done herself. There was a pair of white wool booties with matching jacket and hat. There was a blanket in white wool and a blanket in white flannel cotton. There was a plain white linen hat with lace trimming. There was my christening outfit. There were 2 of my baby bottles, one in the shape of a normal baby bottle and the other shaped like a boat, with a nipple on either end. There was a thermos in which my mother had kept a tea that was supposed to have a soothing effect on me. There was the dress I wore on my first birthday, a yellow cotton with green smocking on the front. There was the dress I wore on my second birthday, pink cotton with green smocking on the front. There was also a photograph of me on my second birthday wearing my pink dress and my first pair of earrings, a chain around my neck, and a pair of bracelets, all specially made of gold from the British Guiana. There was the first pair of shoes I grew out of after I knew how to walk. There was the dress I wore when I first went to school and the first notebook in which I wrote. There were sheets for my crib and the sheets for my first bed. There was my first straw hat, my first straw basket decorated with flowers my grandmother had sent me from Dominica. There were my report cards, my certificates of merit from school, and my certificates of merit from Sunday school. From time to time, my mother would fix on a certain place in our house and give it a good cleaning. If I was at home when she happened to do this, I was at her side as usual. When she did this with the trunk, it was a tremendous pleasure, for after she had removed all the things from the trunk and aired them out and changed the camphor balls, and then refolded the things and put them back in their places in the trunk, as she held each thing in her hand, she would tell me a story about myself. Sometimes I knew the story firsthand, for I could remember the incident quite well. Sometimes what she told me had happened when I was too young to know anything, and sometimes it happened before I was even born. Whichever way, I knew exactly what she would say, for I had heard it so many times before, but I never got tired of it. For instance, the flowers on the chemise, the first garment I wore after being born, were not put on correctly, and that is because when my mother was embroidering them, I kicked so much that her hand was unsteady. My mother said that usually when I kicked around in her stomach and she told me to stop, I would, but on the day I paid no attention at all. When she told me this story, she would smile at me and say, "You see, even then you were hard to manage." It pleased me to think that, before she could see my face, my mother spoke to me in the same way she did now. And on my mother would go. No small part of my life was so unimportant that she hadn't made a note of it. And now she would tell it to me over and over again. I would sit next to her and she would show me the very dress I wore on the day I bit another child my age with whom I was playing. Your biting phase, she called it. Or the day she warned me not to play around the coal pot because I liked to sing to myself and dance around the fire. 2 seconds later, I fell into the hot coals, burning my elbows. My mother cried when she saw that it wasn't serious. Excuse me. And now, as she told me about it, she would kiss the little black patches of scars on my elbows. As she told me the stories, I sometimes sat at her side, leaning against her, or I would crouch on my knees behind her back and lean over her shoulder. As I did this, I would occasionally sniff at her neck, or behind her ears, or at her hair. She smelled sometimes of lemons, sometimes of sage, sometimes of roses, sometimes of bay leaf. At times I would no longer hear what it was she was saying. I just liked to look at her mouth as it opened and closed over words, or as she laughed. How terrible it must be for all the people who had no one to love them so, and no one whom they love so, I thought. My father, for instance, When he was a little boy, his parents, after kissing him goodbye and leaving him with his grandmother, boarded a boat and sailed to South America. He never saw them again, though they wrote to him and sent him presents, packages of clothes on his birthday and at Christmas. He then grew to love his grandmother, and she loved him, for she took care of him and worked hard at keeping him well fed and clothed. From the beginning they slept in the same bed, and as he became a young man they continued to do so. When he was no longer in school and had started working every night, after he and his grandmother had eaten their dinner, my father would go off to visit his friends. He would then return home around midnight and fall asleep next to his grandmother. In the morning his grandmother would awake at 5:30 or so, a half hour before my father, and prepare his bath and breakfast and make everything proper and ready for him, so that at 7 o'clock sharp he stepped out the door to work. One morning, though, he overslept because his grandmother didn't wake him. When he awoke, she was still lying next to him. When he tried to wake her, he couldn't. She had died lying next to him sometime during the night. Even though he was overcome with grief, he built her coffin and made sure she had a nice funeral. He never slept in that bed again, and shortly afterward he moved out of that house. He was 18 years old then. When my father first told me this story, I threw myself at him at the end of it, and we both started to cry. He just a little, and I quite a lot. It was a Sunday afternoon. He and my mother and I had gone for a walk in the botanical gardens. My mother had wandered off to look at some strange kind of thistle, and we could see her as she bent over the bushes to get a closer look and reach out to touch the leaves of the plant. When she returned to us and saw that we had both been crying, she started to get quite worked up. But my father quickly told her what had happened, and she laughed at us and called us her little fools. But then she took me in her arms and kissed me, and she said that I needn't worry about such a thing as her sailing off or dying and leaving me all alone in the world. But if ever after that I saw my father sitting alone with a faraway look on his face, I was filled with pity for him. He had been alone in the world all that time, what with his mother sailing off on a boat with his father and never seeing her again, and then his grandmother dying while lying next to him in the middle of the night. It was more than anyone should have to bear. I loved him so and wished that I had a mother to give him, for no matter how much my own mother loved me, it could never be the same. When my mother got through with the trunk, and I had heard again and again just what I had been like, and who said what to me at what point in my life, I was given my tea, a cup of cocoa, and a buttered bun. My father, by then, would return home from work, and he was given his tea. As my mother went around preparing our supper, picking up clothes from the stone heap or taking clothes off the clothesline, I would sit in a corner of our yard and watch her. She never stood still. Her powerful legs carried her from one part of the yard to the other, and in and out of the house. Sometimes she might call out to me to go and get some thyme or basil or some other herb for her, for she grew all her herbs in little pots that she kept in a corner of our little garden. Sometimes when I gave her the herbs, she might stoop down and kiss me on my lips and then on my neck. It was in such a paradise that I lived. The summer of the year I turned 12, I could see that I had grown taller. Most of my clothes no longer fit. When I could get a dress over my head and waist, then came up to just below my chest. My legs had become more spindle-like, the hair on my head even more unruly than usual. Small tufts of hair had appeared under my arms, and when I perspired, the smell was strange, as if I had turned into a strange animal. I didn't say anything about it, and my mother and father didn't seem to notice, for they didn't say anything either. Up to then, my mother and I had many dresses made out of the same cloth, though hers had a different, more grown-up style, a boat neck or a sweetheart neckline and a pleated or gored skirt, while my dresses had high necks with collars, a deep hemline, and of course a sash that tied in the back. One day, my mother and I had gone to get some material for new dresses to celebrate her birthday, the usual gift for my father. When I came upon a piece of cloth, a yellow background with figures of men dressed in long ago fashion seated at pianos that they were playing, and all around the musical notes flying off into the air, I immediately said how much I loved this piece of cloth and how nice I thought it would look on both of us. But my mother replied, "Oh no, you're getting too old for that. It's time you had your own clothes. You just cannot go around the rest of your life looking like a little me." To say that I felt the earth swept away from under me would not be going too far. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it. No accompanying little laugh, no bending over and kissing my little wet forehead, for suddenly I turned hot, then cold, and all my pores must have opened up, for fluids just flowed out of me. In the end, I got my dress with the men playing their pianos, and my mother got a dress with red and yellow overgrown hibiscus. But I was never able to wear my own dress or see my mother in hers without feeling bitterness and hatred, directed not so much toward my mother as toward, I suppose, life in general. As if there were not enough, my mother informed me that I was on the verge of becoming a young lady. So there were quite a few things I would have to do differently. She didn't say exactly just what it was that made me on the verge of becoming a young lady. And I was so glad of that because I didn't want to know. Behind a closed door, I stood naked in front of a mirror and looked at myself from head to toe. I was so long and bony that I more than filled up the mirror, and my small ribs pressed out against my skin. I tried to push my unruly hair down against my head so that it would lie flat, but as soon as I let it go, it bounced up again. I could see the small tufts of hair under my arms, and then I got a good look at my nose. It had suddenly spread across my face, almost blotting out my cheeks, taking up my whole face, so that if I didn't know I was me standing there, I would have wondered about that strange girl. And to think that only so recently my nose had been a small thing, the size of a rosebud. But what could I do? I thought of begging my mother to ask my father if he could build for me a set of clamps, into which I could screw myself at night before I went to sleep, and which would surely cut back on my growing. I was about to ask her this when I remembered that a few days earlier I had asked my most pleasing, winning way for a look through the trunk. A person I did not recognize answered in a voice I did not recognize. Absolutely not. You and I don't have time for that anymore. Again, did the ground wash out from under me? Again, the answer would have to be yes, and I wouldn't be going too far. Because of this young lady business, instead of days spent in perfect harmony with my mother, I trailing in her footsteps, she showering down on me her kisses and affection and attention, I was now sent off to learn one thing and another. I was sent to someone who knew all about manners and how to meet a great, important people in the world. This woman soon asked me not to come again, since I could not resist making farting-like noises each time I had to practice a curtsy. It made the other girls laugh, so I was sent for piano lessons. The piano teacher, a shriveled-up old spinster from Lancashire, England, soon asked me not to come back, since I seemed unable to resist eating from the bowl of plums she had placed on the piano, surely for decoration. In the first case, I told my mother a lie. I told her that the manners teacher had found that my manners needed no improvement, so I needn't come anymore. This made her very pleased. In the second case, there was no getting around it. She had to find out. When the piano teacher told her of my misdeed, she turned and walked away from me. And I wasn't sure that if she had been asked who I was, she wouldn't have said, "I don't know," right then and there. What a new thing this was for me. My mother's back turned on me in disgust. It was true that I didn't spend all my days at my mother's side before this, that I spent most of my days at school. But before this young lady business, I could sit and think of my mother, see her doing one thing or another, and always her face bore a smile for me. Now, I often saw her, with the corners of her mouth turned down in disapproval of me. And why was my mother carrying my new state so far? She took to pointing out that one day I would have my own house, and I might want it to be a different house from the one she kept. Once, when showing me a way to store linen, she patted the folded sheets in place and said, "Of course, in your own house, you might choose another way." That the day might actually come when we would live apart, I had never believed. My throat hurt from the tears I held bottled up inside. Sometimes we would both forget the new order of things, and we would slip into our old ways, but that didn't last very long. In the middle of all these new things, I had forgotten that I was to enter a new school that September. I had then a set of things to do. Preparing for school. I had to go to the seamstress to be measured for new uniforms, since my body now made a mockery of the old measurements. I had to get shoes, a new school hat, and lots of new books. In my new school, I needed a different exercise book for each subject, and in addition to the usual English, arithmetic, and so on, I now had to take Latin and French and attend classes in a brand new science building. I began to look forward to my new school. I hoped that everyone there would be new and there would be no one I had ever met before. That way I could put on a new set of airs. I could say I was something that I was not, and no one would ever know the difference. On the Sunday before the Monday I started at my new school, my mother became cross over the way I had made my bed. In the center of my bedspread, my mother had embroidered a bowl of overflowing with flowers and 2 lovebirds on either side of the bowl. I had placed the bedspread on my bed in a lopsided way so the embroidery was not in the center of my bed, the way it should have been. My mother made a fuss about it, and I could see that she was right, and I regretted very much not doing that one little thing that would have pleased her. I had lately become careless, she said, and I could only silently agree with her. I came home from church, and my mother still seemed to hold the bedspread against me, so I kept out of her way. At 2:30 in the afternoon, I went off to Sunday school. At Sunday school, I was given a certificate for best student in my study of the Bible group. It was a surprise that I would receive the certificate on that day, though we had known about the results of a test weeks before. I rushed home with my certificate in hand, feeling that this was the prize. I would reconquer my mother, a chance for her to smile on me again. When I got to our house, I rushed into the yard and called out to her, but no answer came. I then walked into the house. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I heard sounds coming from the direction of my parents' room. My mother must be in there, I thought. When I got to the door, I could see that my mother and father were lying in their bed. It didn't interest me what they were doing, only that my mother's hand was on the small of my father's back, and that it was making a circular motion. But her hand, it was white and bony, as if it had long been dead and had been left out in the elements. It seemed not to be her hand, and yet it could only be her hand. So well did I know it. It went around and around in the same circular motion, and I looked at it as if it would never see anything else in my life again. If I were to forget everything else in the world, I could not forget her hand as it looked then. I could also make out the sounds I had heard with her kissing my father's ears and his mouth and his face. I looked at them for I don't know how long. When I next saw my mother, I was standing at the dinner table that I had just set, having made a tremendous commotion with knives and forks as I got them out of their drawer, letting my parents know that I was home. I had set the table and was now half standing near my chair, half draped over the table, staring at nothing in particular and trying to ignore my mother's presence. Though I couldn't remember our eyes ever having met, I was quite sure that she had seen me in the bedroom, and I didn't know what I would say if she mentioned it. Instead, she said in a voice that was sort of cross and sort of something else, "Are you going to just stand there and do nothing all day?" The something else was new. I had never heard it in her voice before. I couldn't say exactly what it was, but I know that it caused me to reply, "And what if I do?" And at the same time to stare at her directly in the eyes. It must have been a shock to her the way I spoke. I had never talked back to her before. She looked at me, and then instead of saying some squelching thing that would put me back in my place, she dropped her eyes and walked away. From the back, she looked small and funny. She carried her hands limp at her sides. I was sure I could never let those hands touch me again. I was sure I could never let her kiss me again. All that was finished. I was amazed that I could eat my food, for all of it reminded me of things that had taken place between my mother and me. A long time ago, when I wouldn't eat my beef, complaining that it involved too much chewing, my mother would first chew up pieces of meat in her own mouth and then feed it to me. When I had hated carrots so much that even the sight of them would send me into a fit of tears, my mother would try to find all sorts of ways to make them palatable for me. All that was finished now. I didn't think I would ever think of it, any of it again with fondness. I looked at my parents. My father was just the same, eating his food in the same old way. His 2 rows of false teeth clopping like a horse being driven off to market. He was regaling us with another one of his stories about when he was a young man and playing cricket on one island or the other. What he said now must have been funny, for my mother couldn't stop laughing. He didn't seem to notice that I was not entertained. My father and I then went for our customary Sunday afternoon walk. My mother did not come with us. I don't know what she stayed home to do. On our walk, my father tried to hold my hand, but I pulled myself away from him, doing it in such a way that he could think I felt too big for that now. That Monday, I went to my new school. I was placed in a class with girls I had never seen before. Some of them had heard about me, though, for I was the youngest among them and was said to be very bright. I liked a girl named Albertine, and I liked a girl named Gwyneth. At the end of the day, Gwen and I were in love, and so we walked home arm in arm together. When I got home, my mother greeted me with the customary kiss and inquiries. I told her about my day, going out of my way to provide pleasing details, leaving out, of course, any mention at all of Gwen and my overpowering feelings for her.